When historians describe the year 1871 in Chicago, they usually focus on the devastation above ground, the great fire that consumed the city, the 300 lives lost, the 100,000 left homeless, the 3 square miles reduced to ash and rubble. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers, the one that even today sits buried in archival footnotes, began below the surface. It started with a simple rebuilding order. Engineers were instructed to clear debris across the burnt district, stabilize foundations, and determine whether the ground could support a new city rising from the ashes. The goal was practical: remove the wreckage, inspect the soil, and prepare for reconstruction. But the moment workers began digging through the charred remains, something unexpected happened. They broke through a layer that hadn't been exposed in living memory. Beneath the basement floors, deeper than any known construction reached, the crews found chambers and mechanisms that didn't match any building records. Their design was unusual, their function was unclear, and the machinery didn't resemble anything in the industrial catalogues of the era. It didn't even resemble European engineering as commonly understood. This wasn't mentioned in the public reports about reconstruction. It didn't make it into the newspapers celebrating Chicago's resilience. But in the internal notes of that year, a quiet phrase appears over and over again: unforeseen mechanisms, unexpected depth, origin unknown. The official story would later simplify all of this into old pump equipment, abandoned factory remnants, or simply misidentified debris. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the recovery photographs from the time, the ones developed in dim offices while Chicago rebuilt itself in record speed, show something different. They show workers standing beside metal housings, cut with precision far cleaner than any forge of the era should allow. Components fitted together so tightly that even in the poor lighting of 1871 photography, no weld seams are visible. Gears and rotors that don't resemble any known American manufacturing, but something older, more complex, more deliberate. And the deeper they dug, the more the layers stopped looking like industrial history as we know it, and more like technology that had been buried, hidden, and deliberately forgotten. At first, the recovery teams tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible: old waterworks equipment, abandoned steam engines, debris from pre-fire factories. But as notes accumulated and more machinery was uncovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the mechanisms built with tolerances far tighter than any machine shop of the time could achieve? Why were certain components shaped in modular form as if mass-manufactured rather than hand-forged? Why did some systems extend into chambers far beyond the footprint of any documented building? And the question that troubled even the most experienced engineers: why were these machines so advanced? Chicago in 1871 was industrializing rapidly. Yet the machinery beneath parts of the burnt district appeared built for purposes no contemporary engineer could identify. Recovery teams quietly admitted among themselves that the design and precision didn't line up with any known manufacturer. And although none of them were using terms like lost technology, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built these machines before. Not simple tools, not primitive engines. Something else entirely. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports became shorter. Descriptions became vague. Photographs stopped showing the widest views of the discoveries. And then the excavation zones were partially filled again in late 1871, covered where needed for new foundations, and much of what was exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments remain: notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of archivists who saw the files before some of them disappeared. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible. Machinery too precise for any known manufacturer. Components too advanced for the accepted timeline. Engineering methods that look inherited rather than invented. Technology that seems to belong to a different era of building entirely. And this is where modern researchers begin asking questions that the 1871 teams could barely articulate. Was Chicago built above a forgotten technological complex? Were earlier engineers repurposing machinery they didn't fully understand? And why did so many parts of the recovery remain undocumented, sealed, or simply erased from the records? Before we go deeper into these discoveries, before we analyze the mechanisms, the chambers, the components, and the deeper technological anomalies, if you're interested in these kinds of investigations, make sure you're subscribed. It helps support the research and lets me continue these long-form deep dives. Thank you. Now, as we move into the next section, we'll look directly at what the 1871 recovery teams uncovered. Not interpretations, not speculation, but the actual machinery, the precision-cut housings, the unexplained gear systems, the power distribution networks buried deeper than any known infrastructure required, and the mechanisms that look like they once served purposes far more advanced than anything we've been taught. When the recovery teams moved past the first recognizable layers beneath the burnt district, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find basements, perhaps some old utility lines, and scattered remnants from pre-fire construction. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within weeks, that assumption collapsed, because instead of a neat sequence of basement levels, the teams uncovered a stack of technological layers that didn't behave the way infrastructure of a normal city is supposed to behave. The first anomaly was integration. Each layer, known basements, unknown sub-basements, and whatever lay beneath, seemed to follow the same power distribution system, the same conduit patterns, the same engineering logic. Different eras shouldn't do that. Different builders, different purposes, different decades. They don't build in perfect integration with systems that came before, yet beneath Chicago they did. Conduits from one era connected directly to conduits buried meters below them. Power distribution systems shared the same trajectory, even when separated by what appeared to be generations. It was as if every group that ever built on this ground was connecting to an original infrastructure, one that no longer existed in any engineering record. As the workers dug deeper, the layers became stranger. Beneath the expected basements and foundations, they began encountering machinery that looked nothing like contemporary equipment. Much larger housings, much tighter tolerances, patterns that seemed too mathematically precise for anything in Chicago's documented timeline. Some mechanisms appeared almost over-engineered. Rotating assemblies with flawless balance, crafted with precision that didn't match the crude factories of the time. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the engineering teams. Water-cooled components, metal surfaces showing signs of sustained high temperatures, lower chambers with heat dissipation systems, housings with ventilation that only makes sense for machinery generating enormous power. Yet there is no historical record of Chicago ever having such power generation before the fire. No documents showing industrial processes requiring this kind of thermal management. Nothing that explains why large sections of the deepest infrastructure look like they had once housed technology far beyond steam engines and water pumps. Recovery photographs taken in 1871 show this clearly. Workers standing beside housings so massive that the men look miniature in comparison. Components machined so precisely that even today, mechanical engineers study the archival images in disbelief. Tolerances and fits that resemble modern manufacturing far more than anything 19th century America is credited with. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports written in the months after the fire barely mention these features. Some drawings omit the deepest chambers entirely. Certain machinery is summarized with vague terms like debris or earlier equipment. Even though the photographs show it was far more complex than that, the silence is hard to miss. Because if these deeper discoveries truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual mechanisms documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across private collections instead of gathered into a single municipal report? Even some of the components raised a red flag. Edges too sharp, surfaces too smooth, grooves too uniform, marks that looked less like hand forging and more like precision machining. Machining that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those components were supposedly made. The deeper the teams dug, the harder it became to fit these findings into the clean, linear narrative of Chicago's past. Because layer by layer, the ground beneath the city began to look less like a sequence of construction phases and more like a stack of buried secrets. A place built, rebuilt, and buried many times, yet always connecting to the same mysterious infrastructure. And this brings us to the most important turning point in the entire recovery operation. A discovery that didn't fit any period. Machinery that didn't match American manufacturing, didn't match European imports, didn't match any known technology tied to the 19th century. Something out of place, something out of time. Because what the workers uncovered next were chambers and mechanical systems that historians still struggle to categorize. Technology that seems to belong to an era we don't acknowledge. Machinery that raises the question no one wanted to ask. What exactly was Chicago built on top of? When the recovery teams pushed deeper into the ground beneath the burnt district, the discoveries stopped resembling anything that belonged to a clean and orderly industrial timeline. What they began uncovering were systems that didn't match American engineering, didn't match European design, and didn't even match each other in any conventional sense. Instead, they formed a strange technological language, one that seemed to come from multiple eras, yet somehow remained unified, integrated, and impossibly precise. The first shock came with the chambers themselves. These weren't crude storage basements or narrow utility tunnels. They were geometrically perfect spaces, rooms shaped with exact dimensions, archways that held their curve flawlessly, and metal frameworks laid out with coherence. Almost like the remnants of a master facility that no longer exists in any archive. Some chambers were sealed completely, packed with fill so dense that workers thought they had hit bedrock. But once opened, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were closed. Smooth walls, fitted metal, and machinery that raised more questions than answers. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today, the giant cylindrical housings. Officially, they were later labeled as old cisterns or abandoned boiler equipment. But nothing about them fits typical water storage or steam generation. These were too symmetrical, too precisely machined, and too perfectly sealed, as if they were designed with tools capable of maintaining tolerances we associate with modern manufacturing. Some housings were large enough for several men to stand inside. Others contained internal mechanisms that appeared designed for rotation at high speeds. Workers from 1871 described them in private letters as engineered vessels, not storage tanks, but containers with a mechanical purpose, though no one could say what that purpose might have been. Another anomaly appeared in the power distribution systems. These were not simply wires or pipes resting on tunnel floors. Many were integrated into the walls themselves, positioned at angles that made no conventional sense, embedded in stonework that clearly predated any electrical or pneumatic system Chicago officially possessed. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The buildings above ground may not simply rest on natural foundations. They may sit on something much larger, an infrastructure whose purpose was never recorded, never taught, and never explained in the official history of the city. The deeper the workers dug, the stranger the findings became. Metal components appeared with perfectly straight edges. Some surfaces were polished smooth, almost mirror-finished. Others showed precision-cut lines so clean that modern machinists still argue about what tools could have produced them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the material composition of certain components. Some pieces were made of alloys that metallurgists of 1871 couldn't identify. Others showed crystalline structures that only form under conditions far beyond any forge or foundry of the era. The official explanation offered later: unusual ore deposits, meteoric iron. But that does not explain why these materials appear in machined components, not raw form, shaped, processed, manufactured into precise mechanical parts. That kind of metallurgy requires temperatures and techniques far beyond 19th century capability, far beyond anything recorded in American industrial history. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. Chambers were filled again, tunnels were blocked, deep sections of the recovery zone were cut off from further excavation. Some of this was officially labeled as safety concerns, necessary to support new construction above. But the decisions about which chambers to fill first and which areas to bury permanently raised quiet questions among observers. Because the spaces that were closed immediately were always the ones that contained the most anomalous machinery. The precision housings, the unknown alloy components, the integrated power systems, the engineered chambers that seemed to extend far beyond the excavation zone. These chambers were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random basements. They were part of an organized pattern, a grid of spaces that looked less like storage and more like infrastructure for something. Aligned, measured, planned, as if they once served a purpose we can no longer identify. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, many were sealed again, their entrances blocked, their purpose unexplored. When you study the final weeks of the 1871 recovery operation, something becomes impossible to ignore. The project didn't end. It was stopped. Not completed, not concluded. Stopped. The deeper the recovery teams went, the more the tone of their notes changed. Early entries were confident, almost routine. But by the end, the language becomes cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be written down. And this is where the final mystery begins. Because the last chambers they opened beneath Chicago weren't ordinary. They weren't basements. They weren't utility spaces. They weren't even identifiable as any known type of infrastructure. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described machinery that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the unexplainable. Housings with tolerances so tight you couldn't fit paper between the components. Rotating assemblies balanced with precision that 19th century America was never supposed to have. Platforms built to support mechanisms far heavier than anything documented in the buildings above. And tunnels that extended beyond the excavation zone, disappearing into darkness beneath modern Chicago. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most advanced machinery was the equipment that was reburied the fastest. Workers described filling entire chambers back in, sealing entrances, packing earth into spaces that had just been uncovered. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation, structural concerns, safety requirements, construction deadlines. But if it was only about safety, why was the most sophisticated, most precisely engineered equipment, the machinery, sealed first? And why was the obviously damaged debris left exposed for documentation? It doesn't make sense unless those deeper discoveries posed a different kind of threat, not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure beneath Chicago truly showed engineering far beyond 19th century capability, and if some of that machinery didn't match any known manufacturer at all, then the entire accepted story of American technological development begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if a modern city was built on top of something far older, something advanced, something engineered, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the foundations weren't just basements, but deliberate attempts by later builders to hide or repurpose technology they couldn't explain. And maybe that is why the 1871 discoveries were quietly reburied, not to protect the sites, but to protect the narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story. Workers standing next to housings that look almost modern, components that resemble precision manufacturing, systems too integrated for their supposed age. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to talk about at all. And that brings us to the final question of this documentary. A question no archive, no textbook, no official publication has ever answered fully. Why was the most advanced evidence, the most sophisticated machinery, the most anomalous technology sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The precision machinery was buried. The unknown alloys were buried. The integrated power systems were buried. The engineered chambers were buried. And even parts of the photographic record vanished, almost as if the recovery operation had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the Great Fire, older than the city we know, older than the narrative we were given. And for one brief moment in 1871, the earth opened just enough to show it. But instead of studying it, they closed it again, sealed it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Chicago stands on top of technology built by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1871. It's what else lies beneath the cities of the world. What other fires? What other disasters? What other convenient destructions cleared the surface just long enough for someone to bury what was below? The 1871 mudflood machines weren't just debris from a forgotten factory. They were a glimpse, a brief, accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your map, your invitation to question everything we think we know about how our world was really built. Because if this is what survived under one city, imagine what still hums in the darkness beneath the rest. Something out of place. Something out of time. This concludes the documentary, but our search goes on.